I recently finished a show named After the Rain. The anime follows a girl named Akira Tachibana and a middle-aged man named Masami Kondo. The girl is a high schooler who, following an injury, is forced to take leave from her track team and gets a job at a family restaurant. There, she falls in love with a 45-year-old manager who is also divorced and a father. Sounds odd, right? The plot at first glance may seem like another silly rom-com, but I found the synopsis to be a little bit misleading. I think the anime brings much more than what was promised in the synopsis. I learned that romance wasn't the main focus of the show, but the relationship between the two as friends, and how they helped each other grow. Those developments occurred when the girl tore down the walls between them, in the pursuit of romance. It's not to say that romance doesn't play a large part, but it felt as if the romance was more of a driving force, used to move events forward, rather than it being the endgame itself. The endgame came in the form of character developments as they dealt with conflict in their personal lives. It's a slice of life first, and a romance second. So, as I began to watch the series, I would encounter a lot of surprises, and find that the show hit a little bit closer to home than expected. This series was able to capture me for a number of reasons. Its unexpectedness, its different perspective, and arguably the most important factor, its timing. In a time in my life where I'm often looking at how I spent my youth and how I should spend the rest of it, the themes explored using Mr. Kondo I found to be very relevant to me. About 5 weeks ago today, I finished my junior year of high school, meaning that there was only one more year until I supposedly leave for college. The biggest thought bouncing around in my head centered around one thing: how I spent my youth. Up until my second year of high school, I'd spent much of my time doing, quote, normal high school activities, such as playing baseball on the school team, but after years of self-loathing, anxiety, and stress buildup, I finally quit. This is when my own passions and exploration truly came into fruition. I spent much of my time outside of work and school doing things that many would consider fruitless in regards to a career or college. Things that tend to be difficult to take note of progression. Things that don't always have tangible results or outcomes. Things that are easy to evaluate and declare that you have nothing to show for your effort. This included myself trying to compete as a competitive Rainbow Six player, watching anime, and other brief stints with photography and more recently guitar. And because these interests don't pave an obvious or straightforward career, I've been agonizing over how I spent much of my time and whether or not I regret it. After all, how couldn't I agonize over it when I always feel as if people around me are always so much more successful and as if I'm falling behind? I'm well aware that these thoughts are by no means unheard of, coming from a teenager approaching his final years of high school, but I often feel as if the time I spent, in particular, was wasted. It is always a constant back and forth, but one of my experiences as of recently that has tilted the scale towards the less regretful perspective is After the Rain. Looking at Mr. Kondo, I can quite easily draw many connections between himself and I. He spent his youth trying to become a writer. He would often agonize over his writing, and his life seemingly revolved around it. He'd invested so much of his time and effort into his dream, but ultimately he never became the successful writer he had always wanted to be. Because of this, he saw himself as a failure. After all, he was a middle-aged man who was divorced and managed a family cafe. And so, for me personally, I saw Mr. Kondo as a potential future version of myself. One who has given up on trying to be happy. One who had failed to accomplish his dreams. One who feels as if he wasted his time. And one who, in the eyes of himself and others, was a failure. That's something that everybody, including myself, is desperately afraid of becoming. This fear is something that feels more and more inevitable as time passes. I also found Mr. Kondo to be particularly interesting because of the extra perspective he brought. It's quite rare to get the perspective of a more aged person who's having more regrets about their past choices. I think Mr. Kondo is a manifestation of many of the fears people have about taking any leaps towards their dreams. This makes him, I think, that much more relatable and interesting than a typical teenage character in any other coming-of-age story. Despite Mr. Kondo's situation, he still puts up a bright smile and does his best to become a good manager. And as the show progresses, we learn more of Mr. Kondo's true feelings in his past. We learn that Mr. Kondo's interest in reading stems from his past dream of becoming a novelist, and that was a dream that he had long ago decided was over. But when a teenage girl breathes life into his long-forgotten dream, he is once again reminded of it. He begins fighting the same battles that I find myself fighting today, regretting failures, asking why the dream failed, and agonizing over whether or not the dream was pointless from the start.
Ah. なんだか最近ふつふつとした気持ちを感じるのはなぜだろう。俺自身何も変わっていないのに。ダメか。
In episode 10, he is found looking at his past memorabilia, remembering his younger self and former drive, but also recognizing what it had taken from other aspects of his life.
俺の文学への思いを誰も救うことができないのか。
I understood how he felt. I truly felt as if Mr. Kondo was an older version of myself. The dilemmas fought, the questions asked, and the regret felt the same as my own. And so I continued to watch the show intently, to find out how his story ends and if I can find my own answer. After several episodes worth of building up his emotions and thoughts, episode 10 brings us his climax. This is the scene that resonated with me the most. Akira, up to this point, had spent much time poking and prodding at Mr. Kondo's interests and past. She was desperate to come close to him and learn more about him. She was able to see glimpses of his personal life and even became involved with literature because of him. Due to the effort put in by Akira, she becomes successful in becoming close with Mr. Kondo. And so one day, following a rainy afternoon, she asks him about a bookmark she had found inside one of the books she'd purchased. After holding it up to the light, they discovered the silhouette of a swallow on her bookmark. This reminded him of a swallow's nest they had destroyed some time ago, perched under the roof of the cafe. He clarified to a worried Akira that all of the young swallows were able to leave the nest, despite one of them being hesitant to fly initially. Akira, leaning out the window, staring at the sky, asks Mr. Kondo what would have become if the swallow had never built the courage to fly along with the others. Mr. Kondo, in stark contrast to Akira, head down and back towards the bright blue sky, then turns around. We are then put in his shoes. The camera cuts from his eyes to Akira's back. He then averts his gaze in shame towards her feet as he portrays himself as a swallow. He states, even if it couldn't fly away, there might be some happiness it could find by staying there. The camera then cuts to his notepad where he compiled notes for the novel that he would never start. He then continued, it might even forget about the others, but if that swallow didn't fly away because it gave up on trying, then I'm sure it'd stare up at the sky every day, forever and ever. The nest for Mr. Kondo was his current state. Being complacent with being a manager and a divorced father, without the passion or desire to write. And while Mr. Kondo believed his words were true, he only found it more shameful that he hadn't followed that same guidance himself. After failing to leave his own nest for many years, he had given up. He had proceeded to, as he put himself, stare into the sky for the years following, wondering what would have been had he continued to pursue it. This message I was able to resonate with because of its truth, that if I always played it safe, I would always look towards the sky and ask myself, what would have been?
How the universe shines the stars, constellates the constellation, and galactifies the galaxy.
After a long pause, Akira says something that gave me somewhat of a revelation.
なんてだごめん、喋りすぎたね。ああ、これありがとう。古本市の時といい最悪だな俺は。
店長。私は店長の言葉が聞けて嬉しいです。
え、俺の？
店長の言葉をもっと聞きたいですし、いつか店長の言葉を読んでみたいです。
俺の言葉を？
店長がメモを取るのはいつか書く小説のためですよね。
こんな俺の？
そんな店長だからです。それから本当に飛ぶことを諦めたツバメはきっと空を見上げることも忘れてしまうでしょうから。
ツバメは知っている。雨の当たらぬ場所は日も当たらぬ場所だと。
私、店長の書く小説きっと好きです。
Mr. Kondo had never expressed to anybody in his current life that he had always dreamed of becoming a writer, and more or less wrote it off. So it made it all the more surprising to him when she stated she wanted to read his words. She explained that she knew about his passion not just for reading literature, but also for writing it, and how important it is to him. She understood that it was something he had given up in the past. She understood that, as he had spoken about the lonely swallow, the words she heard were of himself. With this in mind, she sits at the window and looks towards the sky to remind him. The swallow that truly gives up on flying would likely even forget about looking up at the sky. Following that interaction, Mr. Kondo decided to give writing another try, and finally began to write the book he had been planning to write for years. The book that probably would have never been written if he had not been given the right reminder. The reminder that would ease his regret. The reminder that, even if his dream was unlikely, difficult, or seemed foolish in hindsight, it was still worth every ounce of genuine effort and passion. That having forgotten what your dreams once were is a far worse fate than having to struggle and agonize over said dreams, is how Mr. Kondo puts it after this realization. Any place where you won't get wet from the rain will also have no sunlight. This scene serves as that same reminder to myself. While it is true that almost nothing could truly free myself of the regret and stress brought on by my anxiety and emotions, it certainly does help to feel that little bit more relieved and at ease. It helps provide confidence in my choices and assures me that things aren't always as bad as they seem. Thanks to anyone that stuck around until the end. I really put in a lot of effort into this script, and I hope the video really shows that. I really want to make more of these, but the other scripts don't often feel right to me, so I end up scrapping them. I really want to make sure whatever I put out is something that I can be proud of. Any love, support, and criticism is greatly appreciated though. Thanks.